Hello, my name is Melissa Conley-Tyler, and I want to wish you a warm welcome to this event today organised by AP4D, the Asia Pacific Development, Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue, looking at what it looks like for Australia to be a partner on women, peace and security in the Pacific. I'm joining you today from Anawan Land in the High Country in New South Wales, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and to any Indigenous people who are joining us here today. Particularly this week in National Reconciliation Week in Australia. These are topics that are close to our mind, and particularly in a year where we're introducing First Nations foreign policy into Australian foreign policy. It makes us think about our Indigenous cultures and the way they can form links between Australia and its neighbours, including the Pacific. So I'm delighted that we've had, I think, more than 90 people registered to join us today. Whether you're joining now or joining later at your convenience, we're delighted that you're here. And I'd like to welcome you on behalf of our co-chairs, Michael Wesley and Mark Purcell, and all of the members of our advisory group. So just in terms of what we're going to do today, we're going to tell you a bit about AP4D first. We're conscious we're still a very new organisation. We're then going to outline the process that produced this paper, and then you've got a real treat because you'll be hearing from three of the wonderful working group members who are involved in preparing this paper. So welcoming Sharon Bagran-Rolls, Anna Gibert, and Nicole George, who's joining us with, unfortunately, last-minute cancellation from Elizabeth Coppell. And we're just delighted we have such wonderful people from our working group who are here. Now, the Q&A is enabled, so when you hear interesting things and you want more discussion, please do put your thoughts into the Q&A. We also have live captioning, so if you follow the link posted in the chat, then the captions will open in a separate browser window for you. So, as I say, it's fantastic to be joined by people from each of the 3D communities. Asia Pacific Development, Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue was established with a really simple aim: to bring together people from defence, diplomacy, development, and all the things that don't start with D, like, law and law enforcement and economics and trade. We were very lucky that early on we got great support from our advisory group who saw the potential in bringing people together in this way. We're very much a tripartite initiative, so we're funded through Defence and through Foreign Affairs, and we're housed at ACFID as one of the peak bodies for the development sector. And what we aim to do, as I suppose our proof of why it's worth bringing people together, is we produce options papers looking at particular topics in Australian foreign policy, bringing together expertise from a wide variety of experts, and we then share that with the policy community. So far, we've produced a lot of papers in our 18 months or so that we've been going. You can see our early work looking at Australia and the Pacific and Australia and Southeast Asia. How do we shape a shared future? And then some of our more recent papers, including most recently looking at Timor-Leste and illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing. Today, we're absolutely delighted to be launching a paper which we have done with the support of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade Office of the Pacific. We're working on a 2-year program with Office of the Pacific to bring together external expertise to, increase, to consult, to develop and test ideas, to, always be bringing new ideas into Australian statecraft. And to tell you a little bit more about that partnership and why this topic was chosen, I was hoping to call on Jane Bastian-Sikometti. I'm just checking, is Jane on the line? Well, she may be joining us later, in which case, but if maybe I could use this moment to just say many, many thanks to Office of Pacific, particularly to Liz Peake and Matt Ramage, who saw the potential of us working together. And Jane was very clear that this topic, looking at women, peace and security in the Pacific, was one that could really add value to the thinking in government. And so we, as I say, have been privileged to bring together a fantastic group of people to talk about it. So I'm going to hand over now to Heather Rathel, who's our program lead at AP4D, who's run this process. She can tell you a little bit more about the process that was gone through, and then I'm really looking forward to hearing our working group members. Over to you, Heather. And your sound isn't coming through yet, Heather.
Sorry about that. Yes, so thank you, Melissa. This paper is the culmination of three months worth of consultation with a wide range of people from both the Pacific region and Australia. And it really tries to answer the question, what does it look like for Australia to be a strategic partner on women, peace and security with the Pacific? It sets out a bit of a vision for what this could look like, and then tries to identify pathways that could move us closer towards the vision. So the process we went through to get to this point, you can see we had a large dialogue where we consulted with a range of people. Some examples of the people that attended that dialogue are up on the screen now, came from a range of NGOs as well as academic institutions. And of course, we were honoured to have Paseta Numi-Asimi and Dr. Quitko provide opening remarks and set the scene for that discussion. That was a broader discussion to kind of raise issues and to float ideas and hear what was on people's minds in terms of this space. We then moved on to a smaller group of people. We had a bit of a core working group, but we also went out to a lot of people beyond the working group and held one-on-one consultations or small group consultations to canvass more ideas, to dig deeper on things that had come up and try and hear from as many people as we could. And you can see there on the screen the names of the people that we consulted with. And I think you'll agree it's quite a broad range of people from both within Australia and the region. So following all of that, we drew that together, all the great ideas and information and insight that came out of those consultations, and we drew it into this paper. The structure of the paper follows a fairly standard AP4D format. Those of you who are familiar with our papers will recognise that format. Basically, we put forward a bit of a case for why this matters. And I imagine most of you online today understand why it matters and see it as a matter of importance. And then we talk briefly about progress since the summit. So there was a Women, Peace and Security Summit held in Samoa and co-hosted by New Zealand in 2019. And we just look at what came out of that and what's happened since then. The paper then covers quite broadly Australian views and Pacific views on the issue and looks at where there's areas for alignment as well as where we might have different views and there might be some more work to be done there, or we may just have differing views, and that's okay. It looks at some of the barriers and challenges to moving forward on the women, peace and security agenda. And then the bit that I think you'll probably be most interested in and is an interesting part of the paper is the vision. It looks at what we would like what would like the partnership between Australia and the Pacific to look like, and then we set out those pathways to get there. So before I jump into the vision, because I think that's probably where we'll spend most time just quickly now before we move to the panel, I will just quickly touch on the summit. So as I said, in 2019, there was a co-hosted summit in Samoa, and the idea of that was looking at how we could promote and implement Resolution 1325 and the other resolutions that sit within the WPS agenda in the Pacific context, and looking at some of those unique features of the Pacific region, looking at the traditional systems, looking at the issues of climate change, looking at the way that women respond to security threats and build peace, both within formal security institutions and law enforcement institutions, but also broader than that, and all the incredible work that kind of happens through community organisations or civil society or outside of that formal mechanism. From that summit, there was a suite of recommendations put forward about how we could move forward in this space. Now, since then, obviously, COVID hit, there's been major disasters, a whole range of things has happened, and perhaps those recommendations haven't been taken forward in a integrated or coordinated way, but that's not to say that the WPS agenda hasn't moved on on lots of different fronts in lots of different ways, and some really significant and valuable work happening in this space. And I think that the COVID-19 pandemic provides such a great example of a situation where women are at the front line of a security threat, working tirelessly, sometimes at risk to themselves, doing really significant work, but that might not be picked up in that kind of, well, what does security look like, and that more traditional definition of security, or hard security, if you like. So that's a bit of a snapshot of the summit and what's happened since then. But
Heather, can I just say the screen isn't coming up perfectly. Would you mind making it larger so people can read these excellent results?
Oh, sorry about that. How's that? Is that better? Let me just jump through to where we were up to.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
All right, just bear with me. We're almost there, I think. Yeah, so now we'll move to looking at what I spoke about earlier, which is the vision in practice, which is looking forward to a point in time to say, what do we want that relationship to look like between the Pacific region and Australia, and how would we like to see the WPS agenda move forward? And this is just a bit of a snapshot and a bit of a flavour of some of the things that came out through the consultation processes. So I do really encourage you to download the paper, to read it, and have a more kind of, and engage more fully with some of the stuff that has come out of it. But you'll see there things like we would like to see WPS prioritised because it leads to better security outcomes, that it's not seen as sort of an add-on or a tick the box or a women's thing that happens over on the side. The real dividends that come from the WPS agenda are recognised and prioritised. As well, looking at how we recognise and amplify and resource all that significant work that I mentioned before that's happening outside of the formal security architecture. So looking at the work women's organisations, civil society organisations, or some of these non-traditional peace and security apparatuses, or however you want to look at it. How can Australia support and amplify that work? And in order for Australia to do that effectively, there was a recognition that Australia's assistance to the Pacific, or engagement with the Pacific, really needs to be underpinned by a deep and contextual understanding of the region, who the actors are, what the issues are, kind of what the political economy is. And that was identified as an area where perhaps there's some work for Australia a place where there's some room for Australia to do some more work. And as well, in terms of what Australia can do, it's not just all about looking out into the region and seeing what needs to happen out there. It's also looking what needs to happen in Australia's backyard. How can we implement WPS, the WPS agenda more effectively at home? How can we have that interlinked domestic and international focus, as well as promote WPS within our own security organisations, recognising that in many cases they're far from perfect, and there's work to be done there as well. So again, that's sort of a snapshot of the vision. Please dig into the paper to read a bit more about that. But after we sort of set the vision, we then went and said, well, what are some pathways that we could usefully pursue that would move us closer towards realising this vision? And there's sort of three broad headings, and I don't think any of them will come as a great shock to anybody. It is quite, some of you may have heard this stuff before, but this is what came through the consultations and from the people that we spoke with. One is looking at how we can support existing Pacific agendas. So there was the Regional Action Plan for Women, Peace and Security in the Pacific, that went from 2012 to 2015. And of course, Sharon on the line here is much more of an expert on that than I'll ever be. But just recognising that there is existing policy work and strategies within the Pacific, and we don't need to create a new thing in order to progress this. We can apply a lens to existing work, at one of those things being the 2050 strategy. Also recognising climate change is the #1 security threat to the Pacific, recognising that it's a kind of a non-traditional threat to security, but we're realising more and more just what a threat it is, and really understanding that nexus between gender, security and climate change. And then in doing that Australia plays that facilitating and coordinating role. So getting behind the Pacific in what they're trying to achieve, rather than, trying to put something over the top of that. The next one is working with Pacific women. And I think this is in recognition of the incredible work that is already happening through civil society organisations, through faith-based communities through different things that already exist in the Pacific and say, well, how can we support those? How can we support Pacific women to define and drive their own agendas for peace and security? And sitting beside that, which I've already touched on, is in order for Australia to do that, we need to understand the context. We can't, we're not going to know what to do unless we understand what's happening, and recognise that the Pacific is a diverse place. It's not one thing across the whole Pacific. There's a whole range of different and diverse contexts and cultures, and Australia can do a lot in that to improve understanding in that space at home. And then finally is looking at, and again, this is that looking back at Australia sort of section of the paper. And that's again looking at how we apply that interlinked focus and how we hold Australian institutions more accountable. So the work that they do, whether that's overseas or at home, how do we ensure that WPS commitments that we've signed up to, that Australia has signed up to, are being borne out in implementation and operationalisation of the various things that we do. So they were some of the pathways that we identified, and we thought here is a space that Australia could add value in and could move that partnership with the Pacific on WPS forward. But I'm sure you're sick of hearing from me. I do encourage you to dig into the paper, download the paper and read it and engage with the material in it. But now I'm going to move to our wonderful panel. So as Melissa mentioned at the beginning, we've got 3 wonderful working group members who were really so generous in sharing their expertise and insights and knowledge and ideas in bringing this paper together. And so, of course, we have Sharon Bagwin-Rolls from Shifting the Power Coalition. We have Nicole George from the University of Queensland, and Anna Jabert, who's an international development consultant with a long history of gender and gender-related issues in the Pacific. So welcome all of you. We're so thrilled that you can join us. I will just say to the audience, we are going to be taking questions from the audience in a little while. So I would ask if there are things that you would like to ask or things that you'd like to hear the panel's views on, please use the little Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can just type it in and I will put them to the panel as they come through. Okay, well, I think I'll start. I have a question to start with for you, please, Sharon. I think it's been in the news a lot. It's been front of mind for a while now that climate change is viewed as the single greatest threat to the Pacific region. Can you talk a little bit about that nexus between peace, security and climate change, and the need to work both within formal institutions but also beyond formal institutions to address that threat? Thank you, Sharon.
Thanks so much, Heather, and congratulations on the launch of the paper, but also on this conversation as well. You know, the Shifting the Power Coalition came about because we are living the nexus in terms of the coalition coming together, bringing women who are peace builders, bringing women who are humanitarian experts, and women, you know, really as Pacific Island women living on the front line of climate change. So the whole idea of the triple nexus, or working across the peace, humanitarian and development nexus, made good sense to us. It's the intersectionality, it's the inclusion agenda that we progress very purposefully. But I think in the context of where we are now in the Pacific, and because we're about to launch our Pacific Women's Mediators Network, which responds to a number of the recommendations that you're talking about, you know, from our Samoa meeting to where we are today, and with the support of DFAT, it is actually bringing Pacific Island women from the different experiences, from working with faith communities, from working as traditional Indigenous women, from working as younger women and women from across the gender non-conforming community, that we're really at a place of positioning women's leadership and that vision of the regional action plan on women, peace and security, to ensure that we are looking at the 4 pillars of the WPS agenda into all the priority areas, of which climate is, very critical. It has been recognized by all our forum leaders, including Australia, that it is a critical issue for ourselves. But it's also about really starting to break it down a little bit more, looking at climate change, not just in the context of political issues, but really in that lived reality and the connection with prevention, the connection with the pillars around participation and what are the existing challenges to women's participation and engagement. So that's the whole thinking around why we are coming together as a Pacific Island feminist network around the work to drive women's political leadership in political mediation. That's really important, because one of the biggest threats, I will say threats, in terms of talking about climate security is when it becomes militarized. And we're seeing that because quite often when we're dealing with disasters or other humanitarian crisis situations, it becomes about boots on the ground rather than supporting the women living on the front line and actually leading communities. So for us, it's really about, talking about climate security, but redefining it into the context of our human security commitments in terms of what I anticipate will be a revitalization through the Pacific Leaders Gender Equality Declaration adopted in November to drive that gender equality commitment, but also in terms of the fact that the Blue Pacific Strategy requires us to look at peace and security as well as climate and DRR. So it's really about moving an agenda forward that requires us to take that nexus approach, to take the lived reality approach, and that's vital. I just want to make one final point as well, that a lot of this in terms of climate security is, we've got a lot of evidence. So if you need me to talk more about it, it's fine. But I think the issue also when it comes to climate security and the investment in the WPS agenda, whether it's at the national level by the Australian government, or whether it's in the context of the foreign policy and looking at the kinds of investments such as in our new program, we have to talk about equitable resources to really enable that civil society leadership from within our Pacific Island countries. It is really important to be able to make sure that the resources are there definitely to support women to organize, to learn, and to mediate and lead in our countries and in our region. But it's also important to ensure that there is a sustaining financial investment to be able to continue to sustain peace building wherever it is. So I'll wrap up with this point, talking to security officials just in the past week here in Suva, and one particular country saying, we want to do peace building. We need to look at the unresolved issues of the last years. But if there is no investment in peace building architecture, in the kind of civil society led engagements, it's not going to happen. So I really want to appreciate the fact that there is an investment now to help us pick up on the unfinished business of the regional action plan, but it is still a little bit of a drop in the ocean. But I'm hoping that with the amazing women that we bring together through the Women's Mediators Network, we will be able to progress this collective understanding of where the investment needs to be scaled up. Thanks, Heather.
Thank you, Sharon. That's really interesting answer, and I really liked hearing about the the lived reality and how we need to look across at the diverse range of women that are working in the region. And I think that leads me to my next question, which I think I'll go to you, Anna. And when we talk about what a diverse region it is and the things that are happening, the paper suggests that there's a need for Australia to develop and to value a much greater understanding of the local contexts within the Pacific. What are some ways that we can do this well and in a way that emphasises and supports Pacific leadership?
Thanks, Heather. And like Sharon, I want to congratulate you on the launch of the paper. It's really exciting. And actually, one of the things that really like about the paper is how explicit it is around that centrality of understanding local contexts and cultural norms and informal power structures in influencing peace and security in the region. Because in my experience, so much of conventional development assistance and security interventions has been really premised on that deficit model, that it's the assumption that it is a lack of resources and technical capability that's the root cause of insecurity and inequality in Pacific Island countries. And yet so many of these donor projects that are led by expatriate advisors and expatriate project managers equipped with theories of change and technical solutions fail so often to even intersect with the real drivers and blockers of change that are within the complexity of Pacific Island political economies. And so many do, just to be frank, and I think so many of us will agree, are well-meaning failures. And as Sharon's alluding to, so the main reason for this is that they're not directed and guided by those with the deep lived experience and savvy as to why the status quo is as it is, and how relationships work, how political settlements are reached, what incentivizes power holders, how faith and custom influence social and personal behaviours, i.e. local Pacific experts. And so I think that the paper points to very tangible and practical ways how this can be addressed, particularly from Australia's position, where under our new government, there are very heartening indications of a shift towards more contextually savvy and locally led approaches. And of course, we're all waiting eagerly for the new international development policy to really crystallise that. But these include building on and learning from the standout examples of Australian assistance that has taken more of a supportive and, the word that comes through this paper, a more humble role that really amplifies and strengthens connections between local reformist actors. Australia's support to Sharon's coalition, Shifting the Power, is a clear case in point, obviously, as is the other DFAT-funded investment that I'm involved in, Balance of Power across Fiji, Vanuatu and Tonga. But whereas an outsider consultant like me plays a purely, behind-the-scenes secretarial role reporting to Pacific Islander executive directors, who are so much more capable of identifying the entry points, leveraging influence to shift norms and behaviours around better governance and around gender dynamics. Just to finish, I think the paper is also really strong practically on emphasising that front-loaded analytical investment that Australia needs to make to inform the nature of its interventions and programs and partnerships, just so it's much more clear-eyed around how to support the transformational change that the pledges and platforms and are calling for, but so it's through these local reformists and not perpetuate a status quo by the more easy transactional superficial relationships with often usual suspects who often don't share the same developmental good governance aspirations. I think that the paper really strongly positions local knowledge and local understanding as central to the WPS agenda.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for those comments. And it's interesting to hear about how you talk about how a lot of the work that's happened to date has really failed to intersect with those drivers of insecurity and change, and that there's a lot of kind of well-meaning failures out there. And I know that you've spoken at some ways to address that in terms of that increasing the contextual knowledge that we hold and looking at where the entry points are. But I'd be interested, Nicole, to hear some of your views when we talk about inclusive security and how inclusive security is key to a stable and peaceful Pacific region. How can we do gender better in policy and practice? And how can we do women, peace and security better through our policies and programs?
Thanks, Heather. I fear I'm probably going to say a lot of what Sharon and Anna have already said, but in slightly different words. So I'll continue in the vein. I mean, I think the first thing, of course, is recognizing the vast diversity of experience in the Pacific. Even within Pacific countries, we know there's enormous diversity. So an inclusive approach on gender is always critical. And so that means we really need to pay attention to including the voices of women in all their diversity, whether that's young women, elderly, those who live in vulnerable socioeconomic circumstances, of course, what we might also call elite women as well. And I don't want to use that term pejoratively, because I actually think elite women are really important, but, you know, balance their contributions with all the voices of all those other women, ethnically diverse women, as well as gender diverse and genderqueer women as well. So, you know, that we're really opening up the scope for participation. The other thing I'd say, and I think it's really critical, is that we as outsiders have to get out of our comfort zone if we're going to engage in this work in the Pacific. And what I mean by that is get out of the cities and the big hotels and get out to hear the voices of remote and rural women and women living in informal settlements. So, you know, often their voices can be really easily excluded. And if we're talking about climate change, probably, you know, those women are the ones that are living really on the front line of that kind of experience of insecurity, although it is, of course, cross-cutting as well. But, you know, I think, you know, in those places that may be where experiences of insecurity are most profound. If we are going to work in this way, though, I'd also say that we really need to pay attention to the resourcing issues that Sharon raised, but also some other things, the gendered modes of communication and the cultural modes of communication that may be specific to those places. A very formal meeting in a very formal place, if we're bringing people in from external, you know, from remote and rural settings, for example, may be actually quite an intimidating setting sometimes. I've not for all women, I'm not suggesting all women aren't comfortable saying what they want to say, but some women might be. And I have experienced that in my own work. And, you know, I have seen women become consumed by emotion, anger or tears, and maybe because that feels a bit because they've been put on the spot. So I think it's really important to try and structure meetings in place, and so that they're respectful of the ways people communicate and allow them the time to work through what they want to say, and also make sure that we're really sitting down and making an effort to engage meaningfully with those people. So I just want to say a bit more about that. You know, a lot of research methodologies and meeting methodologies in the Pacific, we talk about talk story or Talanoa approaches, and I think people use that quite casually sometimes, and they don't really realize that a key principle of that kind of engagement is that everyone comes into the meeting with a willingness to be changed by it. And that doesn't mean just those people we're consulting with as external actors. It means that we too have to be changed by the process. So we have to be open, we have to be flexible, we have to be open to criticism. That's uncomfortable. It's difficult for us, especially if we like to think of ourselves as the experts. You know, we have to be held up to account, and we have to be ready for that and engage with those views meaningfully. I think this kind of engagement requires empathy, listening, time, and flexibility. So yeah, there's some of my key ideas. I know there's a lot of talk about engaging men and boys in this agenda as another way of doing gender better. I don't want to sound like I don't agree with that. Of course, you know, if we're going to advance the status of women, we need to talk about men and boys, and we need to talk with men and boys. But we also need those women's spaces. We need those places where women feel safe, where that meaningful exchange can happen in a way where women feel okay to speak. They're not going to be crowded out, and that, you know, maybe men can sometimes sit on the sidelines and relearn the value of women's knowledge and women's power in all its diversity.
Thank you, Nicole. Some really, really pertinent points there, and a lot of food for thought. I think I'm going to jump to a question because I think it flows quite nicely from what all three panelists have been saying. A question from the audience. So James Cox, who was also a wonderful member of our working group, has asked a question. So building on that idea, what Nicole was speaking about, how some of this work requires us to be open and flexible and open to criticism. We need empathy and time and listening. James asks, in the paper, it talks about strategic humility. And Sharon, I'd love to hear your views, what you think strategic humility might look like as Australia aims to work better with the Pacific.
Thanks so much. You might have seen me putting my hand up because I really wanted to come into leverage from Nicole's point around a process that we have co-created within the Shifting the Power Coalition and GPAC Pacific, which we simply call On the Mat. And On the Mat has come about as a result of the need to really provide a space within our traditional, within our Indigenous processes, and it really draws on how women peace builders have worked across our network. But it's come together in a process that starts by saying, we need to invest in that meeting space of young women. And we need to create that space where young women sit and talk together. And I will agree, Nicole, that unfortunately, until we get equity in decision-making, we have to continue to keep investing in our young women and the women-led processes. So we start with the young women. We bring then the older women into a deliberate intergenerational conversation as well, that enables, you know, women to have strong voices and their own perspectives on what is my peace and security, if I keep it that broad. That collective voice then is the time to bring them into the conversations with faith leaders, with traditional leaders, and then to be in that space of collective community decision-making. I think this is where, you know, for a number of years, a number of us have been talking about that subnational investment, those processes that are really confidently investing in that women-led approach within our communities and just enabling us to organize and bring the voice and recommendations into our processes. So it's not just about making parliamentary submissions in the capital, it's really about working through our own traditional and local governance structures if we want to take a legitimate conflict prevention approach, if we really want to unpack the understanding of human security in the context of that triple nexus, and if we really want to build sustaining peace. So this is part of that process of really localizing peace building and saying, you know, at the end of the day, if I'm sitting there with government officials, can I also ask the question about how these recommendations are coming in, and to have the humility to also sometimes hear things in a way that communities want to talk about it. I'm going to talk about the nexus because that's how we live it. Understand it as well. So not come with preconceived ideas of what security is about or even what peace building is about, because it is evolving. We've evolved since 2000 in the context of the WPS agenda. And so we will continue to evolve. And so I think that whole approach of what Nicole was saying, let it get out into those spaces and not be prescriptive, and let us bring back those voices. So for me, you know, just coming back to the Pacific Women's Mediators Network, that's exactly one thing we've heard from the outset of developing our program is our work needs to be connected to the local level. Anything that we develop in terms of training material, in terms of processes, it's got to be able to work back in country and in communities. So it's really about having that sense of humility to say, those Pacific Island women actually know what they're talking about, they're living it, and they're going to drive a certain agenda. Yeah, thanks.
Heather, could I just add just on to the 2 points that Sharon's made and Nicole around, you know, onto the mat and out of the capital city hotels. The third kind of addition I'd make to that and is out of English language. You know, we're hearing so much about women's voices and, you know, the need for really, you know, women on the front line in those really sub-national local communities. But yet we're so, again, from the Australian perspective, just so arrogant, you know, the opposite of humility in our assumption that these kind of discourses and communications and dialogues are all going to happen from our positionality and with English as, or even, you know, forums with, you know, public speaking in English, where, you know, a woman with English as her often in the Pacific, you know, if she doesn't speak English or is her third or fourth language, and because of social and cultural norms, will not be comfortable speaking in that type of environment. And yet there are no there are so rarely accommodations made by Australians and Australian investment to really undo that way of working. And, you know, it's just been such a shame that kind of the whole linguistic competency of DFAT has and AusAid in the past has been so kind of, you know, eroded, particularly in terms of our competency in Pacific Island languages, because again, there's this assumption, oh, but, you know, Pacific Islanders speak English, without realizing just how offensive that is in terms of the language that Pacific Islanders feel comfortable speaking in. So I just could not agree more that unless we're prepared to yield our central positionality to actually provide those spaces where the Pacific Islanders with their lived experiences are going to feel comfortable to talk, yeah, English language just has to be shifted. And I just like, the last point on that is also the language of jargon that we use just so ubiquitously, you know, across bureaucracy, and even, you know, terms like, you know, we just throw around WPS or, you know, JEDSI or JESI and just assume that, you know, a woman from a remote community is going to understand, is it JEDSI now, or is it JESI, or is it WPS? So I just think these are just assumptions that we need to be so aware of if to answer James's question, we're really going to take in a very practical ways what strategic humility looks like.
Thanks, Anna. And someone's just commented that they really agree with you around the arrogance related to language and how that's something that we need to look at and change. I'll just move now on to another question. I think we'll start with you, Nicole, if that's okay. I know that there's a lot of talk about security in the Pacific and you know, growing concerns around security in the Pacific, but the WPS agenda is just as much about peace as it is about security. So in light of this, how do we balance those imperatives, the security and the peace imperatives, when we're working in the Pacific?
Sorry, just on mute. Thank you, Heather. When Sharon was talking earlier about kind of the militarization of this agenda, I was really shaking my head in vigorous agreement. You know, I think there has been, you know, one of the sectors where we see a strong take up of women, peace and security principles is in the security sector in Australia and across the Pacific. And that is impressive. We see more women being recruited into state security agencies and more women in leadership positions in those agencies. And the kind of assumption is that will mean that those security agencies will function with greater accountability and in a more gender-friendly way. Now, as a researcher, I can tell you the research is out on that, on whether that principle holds true, right? And I think we need to really critically assess that, because we always need to remember that security institutions are, since their foundation, highly masculinist, hierarchical institutions, and we may bring women in, but nothing much changes if we just have an add women and stir approach, even if we have women in senior positions, right? Because the hierarchy and the institutional pathways and everything has been defined by a masculine structure. So while it is admirable, and I think there are good women in those institutions doing great work, I think the odds are also in some ways stacked against them, and it will need a lot more women and a lot more time to change the orientation of those institutions. But the other thing I think we need to say is, of course, that, you know, when we have a disaster event in the region or a crisis event, you know, sort of violent unrest, conflict-related violent unrest in the region, automatically going to a security-first response may be important, but it can't be everything. And this is what really worries me at the moment, is that this kind of idea that the security first, get the boots on the ground approach is all we need to restore order is, I think, a real problem. I kind of liken it to putting a stopper, a cork in a bottle of champagne, right? You stop the pressure coming out, but the pressure is still building inside the bottle. And to relieve that pressure, a security first response by itself is not going to be effective or durable. What needs to happen as well is close engagement with civilian actors and particularly with women peace leaders, because they have cultural authority to do this peace building work. They understand where the grievances are. They're well connected in their communities. They know the cultural levers to negotiate and the faith-based levers to negotiate with aggrieved parties. So kind of coming in with a security first, boots on the ground, command and control response, which I have to say Australia favors. You know, we saw that in 2021 in Solomon Islands, where, you know, as far as I can tell, the women, peace and security principles were considered expendable in that deployment, to my great, great disappointment. And then, you know, what you're doing is putting a tamp, you're putting a cork back on the champagne bottle. You're not working with civilian leaders to build a durable peace. And those actors were actually active in Solomon Islands on the ground at the time. And they were, you know, they were not consulted. They complained that they were not consulted by the, you know, the people coordinating, the commanders of the security response, both local and international. And as far as we could see as well, they weren't consulted. So, you know, I think if we're going to have a serious engagement, and Australia wants to engage seriously on this agenda, there may be a place for security agencies to have a role in the restoration of order. I'm not denying that they may have very important roles. However, it can't be everything. And that making the space to have women at the table as those deployments are being planned, and civilian actors to be at the table as those deployments are being planned is critical. Because as I said, women have particular knowledge and particular sorts of power and authority that are critical in these environments. And that, you know, you're never going to resolve the problem if you're only working with a security response. So yeah, I think Sharon probably has some thoughts and probably Anna too on this as well, but it's something I feel quite strongly about.
Thank you, Nicole. And someone in the comments has put that they're also concerned about the militarisation of WPS and Australia-Pacific relations, particularly looking at new funding going to the Defence Force. Now, I'm really conscious that we've got only a few more minutes here, and I do want to allow time for Jane to speak, because it's wonderful that she has now joined us. But before we finish up, Sharon, are there any final comments you would like to make, and what are the key messages that you would like people to take away from this paper? We might just go through the panel, starting with you, Sharon, but really quickly because we don't have much time. Thank you.
Just to say, you know, we've lived the work of peace building, and I'm building on the legacy of women who catalyzed this. I cannot ever not remember and recall Anne Walker, who said to me on, probably October 31st, 2000 or 1st of November, here's the Peace and Security Council resolution, take that work forward from the Blue Ribbon Peace Vigil, because it was exactly what Nicole said. Women were organizing with faith leaders, yet the officials who came into our country to make the peace did not come to meet the women. So I want to remind everybody that the Women, Peace and Security agenda is a feminist agenda. It's a women's human rights agenda. It's disability inclusive, and it's intentionally intersectional, intersectional. What is clearly important in terms of my two key takeaways is, in addition to the need to redesign the table, that this is about participation for prevention, and the prevention in the context of human security, and it's about protection in the context of relief and recovery. So circling back to the triple nexus, this is what we're hearing, and this is the work I'm looking forward to supporting through the Pacific Women's Mediators Network as we get the work rolling out. Vinaka.
Thank you, Sharon. Any very, very quick last comments from you, Anna?
just to say that completely endorse and hope people take away from the paper just the absolute centrality of Australia's investments in this area being supporting local leadership, and that no interventions or partnerships should be entered into without a locally led political economy analysis.
Thank you. That's great. And Nicole, any final thoughts from you before we finish up?
I just would say, engaging, if Australia is serious about engaging on this issue in the region, it can lead by example. It can do so much better than it has been doing. I think there is really good people in all of our government institutions and in civil society really committed to this agenda, and we can do a whole lot more. So I think there's a real chance for us to not lead by words and rhetoric, but just do the hard yards and show the work and show the commitment and show up and listen and engage meaningfully.
Absolutely. Well, thank you to all three of our panel members. I think you'll agree that's been a really interesting discussion. We probably could have spent a lot more time hearing the thoughts and ideas and expertise of the panel members. But before we go, I do want to give Jane Baskins-Sikametti a chance to say a few words. Jane is from Department of Foreign Affairs and was the one that originally asked AP4D to work on this paper. So we'd love to hear from you, Jane.
Thank you, Heather. Thanks, everyone. And I was here all along from the very beginning, but there was a problem with my naming. Just very quickly, I'm Director of Gender and Disability in the Office of the Pacific. I'm an Australian woman of Pacific heritage, so my family are Tongan, and it's a great privilege for me to work in this role. Thank you to everyone who's contributed to this paper and to people who are on the line who are also engaging with it. I think it's really valuable, and I just want to emphasise that I think many of us here, I've got colleagues on the line, many of us here in DFAT and across the whole of government. I think this is a great opportunity for us to really take on board the messages that have been shared. I also just wanted to mention that I think the framing of this conversation today and of the paper in terms of, what does it look like for Australia to be a strategic partner is so important. I think, I don't underestimate the framing of that positionality in terms of Australia supporting the work in the region. I think the messages around localisation, around lived experience are really important. I would note, though, that I think it's really challenging for us in the Australian government to both be a donor, a whole of government partner, in some of our work with gender in the Pacific Island Forum, we're acknowledging that we're a member country participating in dialogue, but we are also a donor. And so, being really clear on the different opportunities that we have, I think, in different roles. So perhaps when we are working on development programs, we're a donor. I think your messages, Anna, around how we partner with the Pacific and how we privilege local knowledge and Pacific women is really critical. But at other times when we are a member country or when we're working within our own organisations, kind of acknowledging, I guess, the power that we have to also kind of influence change and act in a particular way is also really important. And Heather, you touched on some of the domestic issues within the Australian context. I think when we come to gender, we need to come with that position that Australia has our own challenges domestically when it comes to gender equality and women, peace and security, and particularly in terms of ending violence against women in their own homes. That's absolutely an issue that Australia grapples with together with the region. So we need to come, I guess, that idea of strategic humility. I really like that. I'm going to give that much more thought. I think that's an example of where Australia needs to come to the region with an acknowledgement of our own challenges and our own problems. And kind of, I think the way that we come to those debates, that dialogue is really important. So I think there are so many layers to this issue. There are so many opportunities for dialogue and points of connection. And Australia does hold different roles and different positions. So I think being clear on that. But I think the key messages around localisation and acknowledging Pacific women, and I think in the positive way, not that sort of sort of negative model, but yes, actually the wonderful work that is happening across the region. You know, I think we look in gender, we're very good at analysing power. And so I think we need to be real about the power dynamics in the region, but also acknowledge the power of local knowledge and lived experience. So yes, a very interesting area. Something that I think in terms of the political economy within DFAT and Australian government, we'll continue to work, you know, between our gender colleagues, security colleagues and others as well, to continue to broaden our approach to this work so that it isn't an issue that comes from a focus of teams who work on gender and women's empowerment alone. I think it does need to be much broader. So yeah, just like to finish by, you know, thanking you all for your contributions in the work and giving me a lot more to think about in the way that, you know, I approach the work that I'm doing in the Office of the Pacific at DFAT. So thank you.
Well, look, thank you, Jane. And I'm sorry about the technical hiccup, but I actually think it worked out brilliantly because it was fascinating to hear your response to the paper and to the panelists who were speaking today. You know, we love the positive feedback on the framing of the paper. And it's really heartening to hear that you're going to be taking some of the messages from the paper and thinking about those more and how they can be applied. So that's exactly what AP4D is here to do. And we're delighted to have had this opportunity. So if I can just end up quickly by thanking all of our speakers today. So thank you to Sharon, Anna, Nicole. Wonderful to hear your thoughts. And to thank all of the working group members who are involved. A number are also on the call. It was a long process, and Heather knows it was a long process. So lots of consultations to get these ideas. Now, we haven't covered everything in today's discussion, but that is deliberate. We want to whet your appetite. We would like you to go to the website and read the full paper and all of the case studies and all of the ideas that are in there. So all that's left for me really is to thank you, everyone who got us to this point, our advisory group, all the working group members, particularly our AP4D team, Heather, Tom, who make all of this possible. And really to thank everyone who joined today, who obviously has an interest in this topic and wants to work more in it. So what we do is say, please do connect with us. We're always working on a range of fascinating papers. We've got papers that will be launched soon, looking at how Australia and France can coordinate in the Indo-Pacific, looking at Australia as an infrastructure partner for the Pacific and for Southeast Asia, and hopefully not too long away, one looking at maritime safety in the Pacific, a very important area. So please do connect with us on social media, sign up for our newsletters, and you will keep hearing about all of the great work we're doing. And thank you again to everyone who's made this possible.